this is a paper about deroutinization of labor and second birth in West Germany, where we also look at the moderating role of childcare. And it's co-authored by my PhD advisors, Anna Matysiak and Michaela Kleinfeld. And this is essentially a paper about class differences in fertility, where we are trying to link the current developments in the labor market to the fertility decline. And this is what this entire line of work is broadly about, but also this specific paper. Okay. Right, so our motivation for taking this topic lies in econ research, which documents a substantial rise in inequalities in contemporary Europe and also beyond Europe. Another line of research which showed that actually technological change is a big part of this increase in economic inequalities, meaning that throughout ages, actually, it has only exacerbated econ inequalities when not controlled. By control, I mean by civil society or some regulatory effort. So only then, if it was put to some control, it contributed to shared prosperity and rising wealth for everyone. But if not, then it basically meant that the richer were well off and the poorer were even more poor. And this is arguably happening also now in European labor markets, accompanied by rising precarity. And in this paper, and as I said, this broad line of work, we are asking this question: does this contemporary labor market transformation, which results in class inequalities, contribute to the fertility decline that we observe? And in this paper specifically, we also are interested in whether institutions moderate this link, the institution in question being childcare availability. I should say institutional public childcare availability. So here are some, these buttons work really weird. Right, so I should be at this slide. Right, so here are some contemporary some stylized facts in contemporary developed countries. These graphs are for the OECD countries, but they are basically to illustrate what I just mentioned. So in the last 60, 70 years, we've basically had an exponential decline in fertility, an exponential increase in industrial robot stock adoption and also other technologies, and then exponential decrease in union density. So you could also say the power of workers or the worker control over production processes. And we also see a similar pattern with employee compensation as percent of enterprise income here, also declining. So this basically illustrates in a stylized way, descriptively, what I just talked about, that all of these issues are co-occurring, and we are interested in what way they are related to one another. So this is, again, our conceptual framework, here presented as this diagram. So we are interested in sources of technological change, such as robot adoption, AI, automation, but also offshoring, meaning offshoring production from high-income countries to lower-income countries. How these transform labor markets through their impact on jobs, wages, and so-called task content of work. I will talk about this more in a minute, what it is. And then we are interested in how the labor market transformation influences fertility behavior, such as partnerships, fertility, and the timing of fertility. And of course, there are moderators in this story, such as gender norms, institutions, and education. So here we want to look at childcare, which I guess can be characterized as an institution. So our methodology in this paper comes from labor economics. So this paper is in general in the intersection of labor economics and family demography, like a lot of work that I've been doing. But the methodology for measuring these labor market changes comes from labor economics, and it is called task content of work. So basically this methodology posits that workers do different tasks in their jobs. For example, I do programming mostly every day, right? I'm programming statistical analysis for papers, or I do writing sometimes, or I present at seminars like now. Other people do different tasks like hairdressing or cleaning. There is a wide variety of tasks that people do, and these tasks can be aggregated into categories, which allows us to quantify the demand for certain tasks. And so far, the literature has developed 5 categories. But they can also be aggregated to 2 categories. I won't come into too much detail about this, but the most important message is that demand for some of these tasks, so-called abstract tasks like programming or counseling or interpreting, has been on the increase, while demand for other tasks that are easy to automate or possible to automate has been declining. And this was illustrated in labor economics for a variety of developed countries, starting from the US and then replicated for West Germany, among other countries. So as I said, these 5 task categories can be further aggregated into 2 categories which are negatively correlated with one another. And they described these changes in a relatively encompassing way. So those would be the abstract versus routine work. Abstract work is, for example, again, a programming work or a business analyst work, but also teaching job. And those jobs are characterized by rather relatively high income, relatively stable jobs. I'm saying here relatively because, of course, there is a big variety in that group. But here, the point of this slide is to mainly compare these 2 types of jobs, abstract and routine. So there is high demand for abstract jobs, there are fringe benefits, but also those jobs are effort biased. This is another theory coming from labor econ called effort bias technical change, which posits that workers, mainly abstract workers, are under an ever-growing pressure to adapt to working with new technologies, which creates, can create stress because it demands effort and one has to constantly upskill and adjust their abilities. So those jobs would be characterized as effort biased. And then there is routine work. Here, the example could be a cleaner or someone who's works at a production line in a factory. And those jobs are characterized by rather low income, relatively unstable jobs, right? So these workers are easy to replace because there are many low-skilled workers and relatively few high-skilled workers. There is decreasing demand because now some of these jobs can be partially or fully automated, little or no benefits. But on the other hand, as opposed to the effort bias jobs, they are also more family friendly. So again, or they are believed to be more family friendly. So again, there is a variety within this group. For example, someone who works a night shift at a factory might have troubles combining that with having small children. But on the other hand, for example, a part-time secretary who's not expected to make a career might have an easier time combining her job with a family than, let's say, a consultant in a consulting firm. Okay. So a lot has been said in demography about employment and the impact of employment and the working conditions on fertility. And most of the literature for a long time showed that economic instability is generally negatively associated with fertility through a loss of resources, and especially if it affects men. There was also this strand of literature, mainly from Western Europe, showing that in some contexts, women treated unemployment as an opportunity window for childbearing. But yeah, but for already a couple of years, I haven't seen a paper with a finding like that, so that might have changed. In fact, new research from the last 2 years or so shows that stability of women's employment and their earnings have gained importance in family formation. And especially, I'm referring here to this updated meta-analysis by Anna Matysiak and Daniele Vignoli. So this is a meta-analysis on employment and female employment and fertility. And they published it years ago in European Journal of Population, I think so. And now they updated it, and they're showing actually that this negative relationship has disappeared when looking at the aggregate picture. So a lot has been said about this so-called impact of cyclical factors on fertility, such as unemployment. So cyclical, I mean related to the business cycle, like unemployment, or the type of contract people have, but less has been said about structural labor market changes, so changes that occur on longer time scales and are relatively unrelated to the business cycle. So this is what I mean by robot adoption, for example. You saw the graph at one of the earlier slides. Robot adoption has been growing in the last 60 plus years. And it wasn't halted by the Great Recession, the COVID-19 pandemic, or in fact any of these crises that we would expect to have an impact. So here, to again be precise, we want to focus on these structural changes and not on the cyclical changes. And these structural changes, they basically modify class relations, and hence we expect that they modify also who has a chance to have children and who doesn't. So there hasn't been much evidence on the effect of these structural labor market changes on fertility. There have been 3 papers for the US, Anelli et al., David Otter and Seltzer, and then we published 2 papers for Europe. One of them is especially relevant here, this paper from POP Studies, where we investigated the impact of abstract jobs, which is also, they are also called cognitive jobs sometimes, on entry to parenthood in Germany. And we found that both women and men with highly abstract jobs, so those jobs in high demand, delayed parenthood, but then accelerated, and at the end of their reproductive life, they were the least likely to stay childless. However, importantly, these differences appeared after the year 2000. So before 2000, the differences between workers were much smaller that we document in the paper, and we didn't see this stratified fertility. So in this paper, we want to extend that analysis to the second birth. And we have 2 hypotheses. One is about routine workers or workers with highly routine jobs, and the second one is about workers with highly abstract jobs. So the first hypothesis says that we expect that routine workers would display lower second birth probabilities in regions where this deroutinization process is most advanced. Deroutinization here means, again, that jobs are becoming less routine in nature because of automation and offshoring. And they would have higher probabilities in regions with a greater availability of routine jobs. So in regions that haven't experienced deroutinization to such an extent. So this is something new that we bring here, as opposed to our POP Studies paper, because we also look at these regional transformations, not only at occupations. And the second hypothesis is that workers with highly abstract jobs have higher second birth probabilities in regions which experienced stronger expansion of these abstract jobs, but provided that the region offers good childcare opportunities. So under this effort biased technical change hypothesis, we would expect that childcare availability is more important for women with highly abstract jobs than for women with routine jobs, because those with highly abstract jobs would have a harder time combining jobs with having a family. Right. So this study, oh my God. Yeah, so this study is set in West Germany. Um, and why West Germany and not East Germany? So ideally, we would base the study in the entire Germany. But the thing is that these transformations that I'm talking about on the labor market, they looked different in post-communist economies. So they started much later there. And also the task data that we will use in this paper comes only from West Germany. So if we extended it to the East, we would be assuming that East Germany has the same occupational structure, which it probably doesn't. So we decided to just focus on West Germany here. And West Germany on the labor market side is a production-based, manufacturing-based economy, as opposed to some different European countries which are rather service-based. There is high demand for cognitive labor because it's also a relatively innovative economy, for example, in Germany, has the largest software market in Europe, or many of the European car companies are located here, etc. It also has the highest industrial robot density in Europe, and these robots are mainly installed in the automotive sector. However, it also has a relatively strong labor market protection. So, compared to other European countries, unemployment benefits are generous, and there is a wide coverage of collective bargaining. Even workers that aren't in labor unions are under collective bargaining agreements. So, this is something that's characteristic of the German system. Right. So this graph, these maps showed the long-term regional task change on local labor market level. So long-term here means from the 80s to 2010. So we have more than 20 years of change. And you can see that these abstract jobs, so this scale is, this is a percentage change. These abstract jobs, they grew in all regions. So all regions actually became more intense in abstract jobs, some more than others. And those that became particularly intense, where the growth has been the biggest, are mainly cities and around cities. For example, Munich here. When we look at the regional routine task change, there has been mainly a decrease. So actually there have been singular regions with a small increase in routine task intensities, but mainly there has been a decrease, and mainly in traditional industrial regions like the Ruhrgebiet here or Saarland here. Right. Then when we look at the gender and family context, Germany is also quite specific in that it's considered a conservative welfare state with so-called modernized male breadwinner model. So this means that usually both partners work, but men are primary breadwinners and women work only part-time. Because their role is socially constructed as primarily being a caregiver. And according to the latest data I could access, 65% of the couple households with children were indeed dual partners, but in half of them, women worked part-time. And then 1/3 were single earner households. So this is also quite a big share, I would say. The average age at first birth is quite late, around 30, and the cohort fertility is about 1.6 for the last cohort available in the human fertility database. Okay, so this map shows the percentage of small children in daycare, and you can see that it's, I would say, well, at least from what I'm used to in Poland, it's very small in Germany. So in 2012, which will be the start of our fertility histories, it was below 20% of children in practically all regions. And then in 10 years, there has been an increase. But still, the highest percentage we observe now is around 60% of children in daycare. And this doesn't necessarily mean full-time daycare. It means any daycare. So it can only mean, it can also mean part-time daycare, which is actually quite common, that women work part-time and then they finish work at around 1 p.m. and then they pick up the children from daycare, which is open for 4 hours. Yeah, so for this project, we pull 4 sources of data. The reason is that we're trying to build occupational scores of abstract and regional task intensity. Also, we want to compute this long-term regional change. So we use this individual level survey called the BIP employment survey. BIP is one of the German employment agencies, and this is a cross-sectional survey that's been run since 1978, every 6 or 7 years. And they ask questions about activities done at work, which then could be used to compute these task measures. So we didn't develop this computation ourselves. We followed earlier work in economics. But basically, the kind of questions they ask are, do you do cleaning at work? And people ask yes or no, and that's it. And then you can compute these abstract routine task intensities by assigning these singular activities to these broader categories. Then we merge the data with regional employment structures by occupation from Bundesagentur für Arbeit, which is another German employment agency. And we use that to compute these regional long-term task changes that you saw on the map. We use regional local labor market coverage of childcare that you've just seen. And then finally, we merge all those measures on regional and occupational level with individual data from the German pension fund. So this individual data is a 4% random sample sourced from administrative records. And those are work and family histories of women from 2012 until 2023. So why only women? Unfortunately, the German pension fund does not record fertility of men. So we can only have fertility histories of women, and there's also no possibility to track partnerships. So yeah, this is a big limitation in this research, but that's the best we can work with, especially given that we're working with the second birth, which is becoming increasingly rare, and we need quite large counts to model occupational variety. So we apply typical restrictions with this data, childbearing age, German citizens. So we only restrict to German citizens for one reason, which is that only births that happened in Germany are recorded. So if someone had, let's say, first birth abroad and then migrated to Germany and then had a second child, we wouldn't know if that was the second child. We would assume by the construction of the data that this was the first birth, which it was not. So we unfortunately need to exclude migrants for this reason of measurement error. And we have relatively a lot of person months. We have over 180,000 women. Actually, those are the way gender is coded there is that women and non-binary people are coded in one category. So we actually don't know, to be precise, if they are women or non-binary, but probably almost all are women. Okay, so the model that we're going to use is a mixture cure model. This is a, sometimes it's also called a cure fraction model. I will briefly explain the idea behind it because I know that not that many people use this modeling, so I'm not sure how much the audience is familiar with that. So basically, this is a hazard model But it's called a mixture model because it's essentially a mix of two models. And the point is to separate event probability from event timing. So when you model an event with a regular hazard model and you get odds ratios or hazard ratios, and then you can even compute predicted probabilities, but still you don't know unless you have entire reproductive histories of people, you don't know if you're identifying birth probability or timing. So it can happen that the birth would eventually happen, but you just haven't observed it in your data. So this method allows us to basically separate the two so we can assess the impact of covariates on both birth probability and timing. So here we model probability with a C-log-log. This is very similar to Logit, except it has an asymmetric response function and it's better suited to modeling fertility, especially if the share of births in the data is low, so hence why the asymmetry is helpful. And then we model timing for the uncured with a log normal accelerated failure time, which fits very well to this data. And then we can compute the uncured survival function. So uncured here means have a baby, and that's because this methodology comes from epidemiological studies. Yeah, but basically we can say like at the end what share of people had the birth in what time. So I only put this for formula here because I will show graphs with this survival probability, and then it will be very easy to interpret, even though here it might look not the friendliest. Okay, so in terms of covariates, we include both the occupation level task measure and the long-term task change in both parts of the model. So we are going to model both the probability and timing with those two measures because we would expect them to potentially matter for both probability and timing. But we do that separately for abstract and routine tasks. So we only include abstract or routine at a time. And then these occupation level task measures are set to the year of the first childbirth, and we categorize them into 4 categories. The first or 0 is not working or occupation missing, and this is actually a quite high percent of the sample, 30%, because many women actually stop paid work when they become mothers, but also 50% or so the occupation is missing. And then this continuous measure goes from 0 to 100. So we just divide it into 3 intervals, and then we interpret them as low, medium, high intensity. And then we categorize long-term abstract task change to either low growth, medium abstract growth, or high growth. And then low growth would mean here a growth by 10%, medium by 20%, and high by 30%. And then we categorize this long-term routine change into decrease. So decrease means here -5% decrease, no change, and increase by 3%. So these values are picked from the way the distribution looks for our sample. Sorry. Yeah. Oh. So an additional thing we do to shed light on this moderating role of childcare is that we split the sample by regional childcare availability in the birth year of the first child. So ideally, we would want to introduce an interaction of the occupation level task measure, the long-term regional change, and childcare availability. But this is very tricky in these mixture cure models because they are quite sensitive to a big number of covariates yeah, I mean, you can easily run into a sparse matrix problem when introducing many categories in this model. So that's why we split the sample, and we split it into low coverage, medium, and high. So you would notice that high means here over 30%, but this is actually high for West Germany. So this is why we, yeah, again, we pick this based on the distribution. And then we have a few robustness checks. So first, we estimate the model using alternative latency functions. These functions being the Cox proportional hazards model and a model with splines. The reason is that in the fertility researchers community, parametric models are not really favored because they are considered not flexible enough. So those are the two more flexible alternatives. However, they are also more computationally intensive. So for example, a model with splines computes 100 times as long as a log normal model. But we estimate them nonetheless, and we show that actually log normal predicts the survival probability as well as the spline model. We also make a robustness check where we split the sample by age at first birth. And we censor the sample at the end of 2019 to exclude the impact of COVID. So this is the main model with exponentiated coefficients for latency and incidence by abstract and routine tasks. And basically, let me tell you how to interpret this. So for example, this exponentiated coefficient for incidence for medium abstract task level is 1.26. And that means that women with medium abstract task intensity had a 25% higher probability of having a second birth than women with low abstract task intensity. So basically, as you can see, for abstract tasks, we don't see anything for timing. It's all probability. And there is this positive gradient with the abstract tasks. So actually, women with highly abstract jobs were, again, the most likely to have the second birth. The long-term regional task change also matters. So this would be interpreted as regions that an increase in regional abstract task intensity by 1% would translate to a 20% higher probability of second birth in that region. However, for routine jobs, we don't find much. So some of these findings are significant, but they are an order of magnitude smaller than for abstract tasks. So for example, here we would interpret this as women with medium routine jobs would have a 2.6% lower probability of second birth than women with low routine jobs. But again, these are very small differences, so we don't really, they are not much compared to this big gradient here. And this is how it looks like when you draw survival probability out of that model. So you can see these clear differences by abstract task level. But even though we had some significant differences for the routine, they are so small that you don't even see them on this graph. Right. And this is the same by childcare coverage. And here again, for the routine, we don't find any big effects. So let's focus our attention on the abstract ones. So for example, in those regions with low childcare coverage, women with highly abstract jobs were 28% more likely to have the second child. But in regions with high childcare coverage, they were 60% more likely to have the second birth. So it does seem to matter for them, this availability of childcare does seem to be increasing for the probability of second birth. Whereas for women with routine jobs, we don't find any strong gradient like this. Okay, so I have the additional analysis in the appendix if anyone would be more interested in looking at them, but I will go through them briefly. So in terms of the alternative latency functions, we find that, again, as I said, log normal performs as well as the spline model. When we split the sample by age at first birth, we get a result that differences between these occupational abstract categories are positively associated with age at first birth, meaning that the the older the women were at first birth, the bigger the difference between them. But also in general, women that were aged 35 plus at the first birth have a 50% lower probability of transitioning to second birth than other women. Well, because they are probably approaching the end of reproductive life. And for them, we actually see the biggest gradient in these abstract jobs. So those with highly abstract jobs, they have more than 100 percent bigger probability of having a second birth compared to women that age. Sorry, not that age, but women who were relatively mature at first birth. And probably it means that they do have resources to have children later on, whereas other women might not have these resources. And then when we censor the sample before COVID, we get larger differences between the occupational abstract task categories, which might mean that under COVID, actually so what we see under COVID is that actually these women with highly abstract jobs had children less frequently, but they might have been postponing, and we might not see that in the data yet since our sample is censored in 2023. Right, so about our conclusions, actually none of our findings are fully in line with our hypothesis. So we do find that women with medium routine and high routine jobs have slightly up to 3% lower second birth probability than women with low routine jobs. But again, this is not by any means a big effect. However, we also find that the degree of regional deroutinization doesn't really matter. And then we find big correlations for abstract jobs, which is that women with highly abstract jobs are overall 50% more likely than women with low abstract jobs to transition to second birth. And this difference ranges from 28% to regions with low childcare coverage to 60% in regions with high coverage. And then we also find that an increase in long-term abstract task growth was associated with a 20% increase in second birth probabilities, but it doesn't really interact with the occupational abstract task intensities. So the differences were within these regions, not between them so much. Right, so that's all from me. Thank you so much, and I'm very happy. I'm keen to hear your comments and questions.